let's start with a relatively easy one. So tell me who you are and tell me what you do.
So hi, I'm Vitalik Buterin, founder and chief scientist of the Ethereum project, which is meant to be this decentralized platform that has a Bitcoin style blockchain, but which also combines it with a fully featured programming language. It has a system where you have a set of accounts. Every account is kind of like a sort of autonomous agent living on the blockchain. It has its own code, and you can send transactions to agents and their code can execute. So you can think of it as sort of like a decentralized computing environment that people can sort of put in mini agents that sort of live inside of it. And the idea is that this kind of programming environment can be used to simulate a currency, can be used to simulate a domain name registration, can be used to do financial contracts, because you can actually have some of these agents directly control and manipulate currency units. You know, it literally is programmable money, I think, in a way that Bitcoin tried to be but isn't.
What got you interested first? Was it blockchain technology or was it Bitcoin, the currency, that first caught your interest?
So I guess my dad was the one who introduced me to Bitcoin. He actually first told me about it way back in something like February or early March 2013. And when he introduced it, he was more interested in the currency part. It's like, hey, here's a decentralized currency. At first, I thought that there's no way it's going to fly, basically, because it has no intrinsic value. And then a few weeks later, I heard about it again. And once you've heard about something twice, that kind of implies that maybe might be legitimate, or at least have enough of a high probability of being legitimate to be worth looking at. So I investigated a bit further, and then I decided, hey, why not? I'll just try earning a few Bitcoin just by doing some work on the forums. And the first sort of job I found was someone who was just paying people 5 Bitcoin, which back then was $4 per article to write articles for him. So at first, it was probably definitely the currency. That was what the community completely cared about. It's all about Bitcoin, the currency, and the technology was sort of just there to make the currency happen. And I started looking into it. I started looking into all of the different economic aspects, technological, political, and so forth. And by being a writer, I was in this nice position that I got to do something that earned, well, okay, to be fair, earned only about 20% minimum wage, but then the Bitcoins went up in value, so it helped. Also get experience, get exposure to community, and start to understand more of the technology at the same time. And I didn't really start thinking about blockchain technology as a separate thing, probably even all the way until like late 2013 or so.
I guess what was the jumping off point for that transition?
I think the big sort of leap for me came back when I was visiting Israel in October 2013. And before then, I'd seen a lot of Bitcoin projects. I'd seen all the little Bitcoin accepting shops in New Hampshire. I'd seen the restaurants in Berlin, all the different places, little communities and so forth. And they were still focused on the currency. They were focused on, how do we promote the adoption of Bitcoin as money? And in Israel, I saw a community that's actually very different. There are people working on these projects called Colored Coins and Mastercoin. And these were projects that were trying to use the blockchain for all these other applications. So they're trying to let people issue tokens on top of Bitcoin. Mastercoin was trying to let people do financial contracts. And all these protocols, like these ones were using the underlying, the same Bitcoin blockchain as Bitcoin itself, but they were sort of assigning another kind of secondary meaning to Bitcoin transactions. Once I understood sort of what they were trying to do, I guess it wasn't even that I was immediately sold on the idea of Bitcoin, blockchain and not currency. That's not even then, those weren't the terms that I was thinking in. It's more that I saw these protocols, then I realized, hey, back during my 8 months of university, I learned a bit about programming languages and compilers and so forth. And I just realized, it's possible to massively generalize a lot of what these protocols were doing by replacing all their functionality with a programming language. So why don't I just do that? Or, well, initially, actually, I first just made the suggestion for the existing projects to do that. They basically said, hey, it's an interesting idea, but, we're not going to be doing that for a while. So I figured, why not? I'll just build it myself. And like back then, it was still all about the currency. So, if you read the Ethereum white paper, it's still all about, hey, here's a currency, and hey, look, you can make financial contracts for difference and bets on it. So the idea of blockchain technology as a sort of thing separate from its currency applications is actually something that sort of came to me over the few months after that, over this evolution where Ethereum, and first of all, attracted people that didn't even come from Bitcoin at all. Like Gav Wood, for example, he completely came from a non-Bitcoin background. Once you had this programming language, we were just inventing new things you could do with it every week. At the end of January, we realized that it's actually not that hard to do decentralized file storage. Then we started thinking about name registry, two lines of Serpent is that common example that we always keep giving. And just as these use cases started piling up, it sort of just started slowly changing my perspective over time.
Okay, so from what I understand, Satoshi basically said, okay, here's all these currency applications. We could do a programming element, but that's not what we're going to focus on right now.
And so first of all, I completely don't fault Satoshi for not having invented Ethereum. The fact is that he had already, Bitcoin by itself is already testing, simultaneously a breakthrough in computer science and a breakthrough in economics at the same time. On the computer science side, you had this idea of proof of work as a sort of decentralized consensus algorithm. And then on the economic side, you had this idea of a currency with absolutely zero intrinsic value and zero dedicated institutional support whatsoever. And generally when you're creating radical ideas, you want to test out one of them at a time, maybe two. You're not going to simultaneously try and just throw in a Turing complete execution environment at the same time. So just from a pure safety standpoint, I think he did the completely right thing. And I guess another issue is that it's kind of a matter of perspective to some degree, in that I think though even the biggest the sort of contribution that Satoshi made to the whole, I guess, crypto community, which has existed for many decades, is not, I would say, is not even the idea of proof of work. It's not even the idea of decentralized currency. It's the idea that you can actually do a lot more with cryptographic systems if you simultaneously think of them as being economic systems, and you build the economics right in as a fundamental base layer of the system and not as an afterthought. So, there were consensus architectures before that, but with all those consensus architectures, the way they were set up is, okay, you have, say, 10 servers, and the system works fine as long as 7 of them are working correctly. Now we can survive 3 of them working incorrectly. It doesn't matter, even doesn't matter how they're working incorrectly. All 3 of them could be run by Kim Jong-un trying to screw your system over and print billions of dollars of money for himself. It's still going to work fine. Now if the bad guys control 4, that's a problem, but 3 they can handle. And these architectures, they've existed for 20 years. But the problem with them is that, first of all, which 10 servers? Okay, fine, 10 servers. Who's going to run them? What algorithm selects who these 10 servers are? And before then, the only sort of solution that we had to that problem is basically partial trust. So we say this is a set of powerful entities that are sort of semi-trustworthy. A single one of them might screw you over, but 10 of them won't. And we sort of distribute it out across different ones. A theory being that if some of these are run by banks, some of them are run by nonprofits, one of them by OCAN, one by the World Health Organization, a couple by ISIS, they're not all going to collude with each other, and you're probably fine. And the other thing that they don't do is the system doesn't ensure any kind of incentive. There's no incentive to act legitimately as opposed to illegitimately. So Bitcoin, the big difference is that it includes this concept of free entry. So it's a system where anyone can participate. There are no privileged parties. There's no kind of required pre-reputation or pre-trust involved. And the thing is that in order to make that work, in order to create a sort of set of actors that is simultaneously decentralized and secure, and that you can't have an attacker just come in and say, here are my 50,000 servers and I'm going to take over 99% of it, is basically by giving every actor an economic weight corresponding to their computing power. So that's one part, using sort of economics as a way of ensuring decentralization instead of sort of pre-existing social rules. And the second thing is that once you have free entry, once you have any arbitrary actor participating, you need to have economic incentives. So, proof of work is this nice, elegant mechanism that actually kind of baked both of those two things in. And, because of that, it's done pretty well. So, basically, Satoshi invented a cool consensus algorithm, came up with a zero intrinsic value currency that worked, and made a powerful multi-decade paradigm shift in crypto economics. So, in order to invent something like Ethereum, like all of these paradigm shifts had to have already happened, and the fact is that after Bitcoin came out, after this paradigm shift, it's only after that all these different things, Namecoin, colored coins, financial contracts, Ethereum, prediction markets, and so forth, just all started piling in. The contribution was opening a floodgate. You can't expect one person to open a floodgate and come up with all the water that's going to rush out at the same time.
So tell me about the IBM sense on collaboration with Ethereum. How did that all start? Where did it all come from?
IBM first, I believe, got publicly interested in cryptocurrency way back when one of their employees, I think it might have been Richard Brown, maybe someone else, there was a video of him talking about cryptocurrency and the potential of blockchain technology. And I guess at some point after that, they came up with this idea of let's try to do Internet of Things in a decentralized way. And initially, we weren't involved. Initially, they were just doing this unilaterally. They just said, okay, we need to have our Internet of Things devices talk to each other. For that, we need a decentralized messaging protocol. Hey, look, there's Telehash. Okay, we need a decentralized file network. There's BitTorrent. And we need them to make payments to each other and possibly to, do things relating to tokens, relating to like having some kind of status in some kind of database. And hey, look, you need a blockchain. And look, there's Ethereum. It's nice and easily adaptable to these kinds of applications. So they just went ahead, took the technology, started working on it. Eventually, they made an announcement. And then we actually only found out about it from the announcement. And all of us sort of started trying to get into IBM and trying to make contact with their team. And eventually, we succeeded. We had a couple of Skype calls with them. They, I believe, started working a bit with the sort of independent team that's doing the Ethereum Java client. Eventually, I met some of the Samsung guys at inside Bitcoins in South Korea, and he suggested that hey, I should come to CES and I should go see their demo. And went to CES, saw their demo. It was really nice.
This use case is about the autonomous washer. This is a prototype of a washing machine. We have inside this the software of the Adept architecture. In the first use case, what we are going to show is that the washer is going to say that the detergent is going low. It goes and checks out if there is a smart contract in the background. And then it's going to go and place a request to the retailer that is being represented by a tablet over here. So you can see that the detergent low level is being detected here. It's gone and checked the smart contracts in the background and it's placing an order. Yeah, so the retailer has got this detergent reorder request with the device ID and the smart contract reference. So all this is being done on the blockchain. So now, having got this request, what's going to happen next is that there's going to be a digital payment, again over the blockchain. So this is a digital payment that has come in from the washing machine directly to the retailer. So all this is again using the contract terms, assuming that the contract terms is defining what's the payment for each detergent reorder. So what you're going to then see is that there's an order acknowledgement that is going back to the washing machine.
We got the TVs, the dishwasher, and it seems that there is this small contingent of people and these companies that really are interested in this idea of using decentralized technology as the basis for Internet of Things applications, because the alternative is basically to just have everything be in a cloud controlled by some particular silo. And that's not really not nearly an optimal outcome for what we want, the Internet of Things to be. It's more like the AOL Net of Things, or whatever the different sort of proprietary intranetworks were called back in the 1990s.
What are some of the applications you envision for Ethereum, either now or that have sort of from the beginning, or has your thought about what it could and should be evolved?
Yeah, it has evolved. initially, it was meant to be just as a sort of mastercoin plus a programming language, this sort of form of money that you could do during complete scripting on top of. And initially, the scripting was only even meant to be between two parties. It was, you didn't have this idea of like massively multi-party contracts. After that, we started, figuring things out with a programming language, and I realized that, hey, it's actually possible to write a compiler for this, and that's when I started to realize, hey, you can do Namecoin in 2 lines of code. You can do a sort of decentralized version of Dropbox in like 15 lines, distributed governance, and all these different blockchain-based contract applications and so forth. And the financial use cases came first. These sort of weird semi-financial use cases where you basically have like decentralized data markets, decentralized cloud computing markets, and so forth. They came second. I think they're probably a really important category. And, they're probably a category that needs to exist. Like, I think something like file storage is just such a fundamentally important layer of the internet that I think it really would be much, much better if it wasn't dominated by, one or two particular companies. It's a utility, you should be able to participate in it. It's, I guess the analogy is it's kind of like a language. It should be something that anyone can speak and anyone can understand, not the sort of setup where priests are the only ones providing a service and everyone else just sort of has to, listen to them. And it's hard to say what it'll be applied for first, because the problem is, like, if you imagine throwing yourself back into the year 1960, people were barely doing much of anything with computers. People thought computers were just a fancy way of having a calculator with a few thousand vacuum tubes taking up a gym. And then someone says, oh, hey, I invented a fully abstract programming language that lets you theoretically do any kind of computation. Well, what are you going to do with it? It's, nobody marketed C++ as, hey, this is a programming language you can write games in, or hey, this is a programming language you can write word processors in. All that stuff kind of came later. It's, if cryptocurrency turns out to be useful at all, then I think it's probably going to follow a similar path. Bitcoin Magazine is, it was my second project in the Bitcoin community. The first one was actually writing these articles for $4 an article for this website called Bitcoin Weekly. And it started when this guy from Romania named Mihai Alicia basically contacted me out of the blue. He said, I want to make a magazine. Do you want to join the team and be a writer? I said yes, because, hey, I was happy enough that somebody cared enough about me and thought that my work was any good at all. And I just started writing for it about just about every topic. I covered the technology, I did some tutorial articles, I covered some events, I interviewed a bunch of people, I did some stuff on economics, politics, just about every angle. And eventually, some of our investors were gracious enough to allow me to be paid $500 a month. Some of which turned into $5,000 a month because the value of Bitcoin went up. But and I technically never actually got paid any much more than that. And but the biggest payout for me personally probably just came from being the sort of vehicle that helped me get involved in the cryptocurrency space, understand the issue, and also just sort of get connected to the community. I mean, for myself personally, it was probably just hugely important. But as far as what I think of just magazines in general, what I think cryptocurrency can do to make magazines even more, just media in general, even more innovative. And there's a bunch of ideas. There's this idea of sort of bringing back micro tipping and bringing back micro paywalls and so forth. Some of that could happen. I'm also kind of skeptical of it, mainly because I think there have been a lot of these sort of pronouncements saying, oh, Homo economicus is dead. People are actually so charitable and they're going to be willing to just naturally just donate $5 to articles that they like. Well, no. See, the problem is that there are examples of that happening, but the reason why those examples get into the media at all is because there are these really, really highly salient, hyped up things, and people are willing to just sort of throw in all their energy on one and hype it up really hard. It's not something that's particularly scalable to to just the mainstream world in general, right? So, I mean, it's a nice model, but you sort of do have to think about it kind of skeptically. Another thing is that there are people who hate advertising, in my opinion, I actually love advertising. I think it's probably one of the most brilliant social, innovations as far as, just economic innovations in society of the century. The reason is that let's just look practically at what it's accomplished. Before then, information is something that's it's expensive to produce, and once you've produced it, there's copyright, and so you have to charge a bunch for it, and it's kind of hard to get your hands on a lot of it unless you're willing to pay up, unless you're willing to go around and look for it everywhere. And meanwhile, now with advertising, guess what we've had? Most services on the internet are available for free, right? Gmail is free, Google search is free. WordPress is free. just about everything is free. With Wikipedia, or homeless people can literally, access more information than the so-called robber barons of the 19th century could back in their time. And Wikipedia, I guess, is the one example that's not ad funded. But in most of these cases, it's actually wonderful that you could have this sort of vehicle that actually provides basically, it sort of creates a sort of charging mechanism, which is actually precisely equivalent to what policymakers generally consider to be the optimal taxation policy, which is, you tax people roughly based on their ability to pay. And with advertising, you actually have that exact same effect. The market just generates it by itself. You have a situation where people who can't pay at all, they can still browse the websites and they see the ads, whatever. Meanwhile, rich people, they browse the same websites, they still pay nothing, they see the ads, but the ads might influence them to spend a few $100 or a few $1,000s on other things. And that's where the value comes from. So, ads are a really, really wonderful mechanism in this regard. And I think it's much more interesting to try to think about how these sort of cryptocurrency micropayments can even make these ad markets more efficient and better. And ideally even try to use cryptography to come up with clever ways of making ads privacy preserving. So, at the same time provide people with relevant content without actually ever feeding out the information of what people care about. And, with cryptography, it's actually possible to do this sort of seemingly contradictory things at the same time. So as far as sort of payments versus ads goes, I guess that's roughly my perspective. Now, the one thing that you could do is, this is one of the first things that I did back in Bitcoin Weekly. Originally my employer just paid me, this sort of really tiny wage of $4 an article, and it sort of continued. Eventually my employer ran out of money, and so it was actually up to me when I actually invented a business model that, helped keep the Bitcoin Weekly running for another extra few months. And what this business model is that every week I would write 2 articles, but I would only release the first paragraph of each article onto a forum. And what we would say is, these 2 articles are for ransom. Here are 2 Bitcoin addresses. We will only release the remainder of these articles if people sort of crowdfunds donate 2.5 BTC into the Bitcoin address. And people would actually do that. And, people would actually manage to crowdfund the Bitcoin and the article would get released. And eventually, why people would donate. Some were just interested in the business model. Some people wanted the articles to sort of come out faster. It's kind of this assurance contract model that, it's not nearly perfect, but it does sort of provide interest. It does sort of get you a step up from pure donations, and it works well. And I actually ended up earning something going up to about $10 to $15 from each article. So those kinds of innovations, I think, can. Definitely. The nice thing about cryptocurrency, I think, is that it just makes it so bloody easy to create one of these economic mechanisms. You just write it up in code, that it just makes it really easy to sort of serve as an economic experimentation ground for doing these kinds of things. And there's other tricks, there's this idea of badges where you can sort of create a forum where people can publicly prove that they've donated to a particular cause. And the theory is that you could sort of fund a bunch of public goods just by sort of bundling them with social status. That's also a mechanism which actually works pretty well already. You have a bunch of millionaires donating $30 million to set up their own building and universities. But here it's sort of generalized the mechanism so it works all the way down from as little as a couple $100s. So, the whole point of economic experimentation is sort of coming up with these sort of clever little tricks to sort of combine together incentives and sort of put things together in this nice way that gives people the incentive to do the right thing. And there's probably quite a lot to be done. It's just I think we're barely getting started.
Quick thing. So micro channels. One of the reasons it's becoming more to the forefront. It's coming to the forefront now is obviously with the success of ChangeTip. People are starting to see, hey, there's an application for this. There's an excitement about it.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess first of all with ChangeTip, it's a cool toy, but I think it seems to be doing, it's kind of useful in some ways. So the one thing that actually really disappoints me about it is how they put a $25 limit on the transactions, because that was kind of one of the nice things about it is that it provided a really easy way for people to make nice large public donations to things and sort of, and it kind of serves as sort of one of these hacks that let people sort of make these really public donations, get some social status out of it, and help get more money into charities. But unfortunately, it's not working out that way. Instead, they're sort of really the thing that people are ending up using it for is sort of, hey, well, I feel sorry for you that you lost your grandpa. Here's 0.03 cents, which is kind of nice but not sufficient. So the idea of micropayments channels is that you have this mechanism where, if A wants to make a number of large repeated payments to B, then what you can do is you can say, well, instead of making one Bitcoin transaction for all of them, what A is going to do is I am going to put, say, $10 into a multisig between A and B, and then I'm going to simultaneously sign a transaction giving those $10 right back to myself. But I'm not going to publish the second transaction. I'm just going to keep it. So if I want to end this channel right now, I could end it, and I'd have ended up paying nothing but transaction fees. Now, let's say I want to pay B 1 cent. What I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this transaction that pays the $10 back to me with a transaction that pays $10 back to me, or $9.99 back to me, and 1 cent over to B. And I'm going to get myself to sign. I'm going to get B to sign it. And this transaction has a sort of slightly lower lock time than the first one, so it's guaranteed to be valid first. And so now, eventually, if B wants, B is going to be able to sort of extract that 1 cent. Now, if I want to make another payment, I'll rewrite the transaction again, and I'm going to give $9.98 to myself, 2 cents to B, and so forth. And the key trick is, eventually the channel ends. Eventually, either A or B submits the transaction. But the thing is that instead of it being one transaction per value transfer, it's one transaction per settlement. So you could have many, many transactions, only one settlement. 2 transactions go on the blockchain, you pay 2 fees instead of 2,000 fees. So it's sort of a scalability solution that's targeted toward a very, very, very particular use case. And it is nice. And there is this idea that people have been thinking of what's called micropayment channel hubs, where a bunch of people have these sort of accounts with micropayment channel providers. And then you're creating basically a sort of, again, it's kind of like a version of PayPal, except it's a trust-free version of PayPal in the sense that the centralized intermediary does not actually control the money. Instead, it's a system where the centralized intermediary basically only just sort of acts as a sort of managing party for these micropayment channels. All of the funds are still held in the multisigs, and they're still basically ultimately under the control of all the users. So it's this elegant setup that theoretically, if we get it right, could potentially, it could delay sort of the Bitcoin scalability issues for some period of time. The one thing I hope is that we get together and try and come up with common protocols for this. What I don't want to see is, here's Coinbase's micro payment channel tipping thing, and here's BitPay's payment channel thing, and here's someone else's payment channel thing, and they're all just not going to interact with each other, and you sort of have to sign up for each individual centralized service. As I was saying before, the thing that I really believe is powerful about crypto economics is this idea that we need to have a free entry market. And the thing with the whole point of free entry market is unbundling software developers from software providers, right? And so if instead we have a system where here is the protocol, anyone can become a micropayment channel provider, then we have a system that's properly decentralized, and or at least it's as decentralized as you can get with this particular architecture, and it'll do a really good job. So that is, that's something that it does have promise. And the other question is, what will it get actually used for? Yeah, sure, micro tipping, and eventually, I guess this it would be nice to have this micro tipping thing be grow into something that's sort of more useful and hopefully something will come out of it. But the other application for micropayment channels is actually in some of these sort of applications for crypto. So, there's these use cases where if I'm downloading a file from you, you don't want a system where you send the file and then I pay because I have the incentive not to pay. Now, there is a clever protocol that actually uses some cryptography to get around that, but it's an alternative approach is you send 32 kilobytes, I pay a microcent. You send 32 kilobytes, I pay a microcent. You send 32 kilobytes, I pay a microcent. In order to do that scalably, you need a micropayment channel. Now, bandwidth is another example. The one sort of other practical example of how cryptocurrency can be used that I often bring up is this idea of a sort of single hop mesh networking market. So the story that I give is I am going into a foreign country. My data plan no longer works, and I turn on Wi-Fi, and I see there's 100 Wi-Fi hotspots around me. All of them have passwords, and so I can't get into any of them. Now, guess what? I sit down. Around me, there are 50 people. Of these 50 people, at least some certainly know the passwords to these hotspots. Some of them have data connections. There's people with internet all around me. Why can't I have my own bloody internet connection? So the solution is pretty simple, single hop mesh networking market. So any of these people can download an app and they can sort of run as proxies, sort of proxying internet connectivity from wherever they're getting their internet from to me. And I would pay them a microcent a kilobyte for this for the service of forwarding the internet packets. So they would earn a few cents. I would get my internet connection, my internet access, and we'd both be happy. So the nice thing about this kind of application actually is that it doesn't even need to provide that high an income for it to be worth it for people to download, right? So the thing with something like cryptocurrency, or if you look at something like Ether, for example, the point of Ether at low levels of currency is to use it as just a sort of mechanism for paying transaction fees for applications. If you have 0 Ether, you can't run your applications. If you have 10 cents of Ether, you can send a bunch of transactions. So you'll end up with a lot of situations where 10 cents of Ether is actually basically worth like many dollars to people, and 20 cents is not really worth that much more. So in those cases, people are, even if the payouts are tiny, I think people are still going to be jumping over themselves to download this app and to try and get these sort of few cents in order to provide wireless connectivity to people, and everyone else gets their wireless connectivity. So. And it's just another sort of practical example of where micropayment channels can really help. So it's a technology that has it's not perfect, and there are things that it can't do. It's not a generalized scalability solution, but it does solve specific problems, and and the specific things that it does well. And I guess that's what I like about it. The term crypto economics in general, it came out of this realization that, as we were working on cryptocurrency problems, what we realized is that we've discovered this sort of set of primitives, this sort of set of different ideas that sort of work together, and it's something that's not really quite cryptography. Because, the underlying cryptography in blockchain technology is just pathetic. It sounds hard to the layman, but compared to other modern cryptography, it's pathetically easy. Like, once you know what a hash function is, once you know what public key cryptography is, that's it. That's all you need. You don't need to know about zero knowledge proofs. You don't need to know about snarks. You don't need to know about linear and differential cryptanalysis. You don't need to know about indistinguishability obfuscation and private information retrieval, whatever other ungodly things people are inventing these days. And it's just two simple it's actually two relatively simple building blocks in the grand scheme of things, and that's it. It's kind of it's not really thinking about them. It's about using them as Lego bricks. So there's a kind of analogy here to, I guess, how biology takes advantage of chemistry, right? And that you talk about how you have glucose, and then glucose gets converted through some pathways. You get it combined with oxygen, get some CO2 and some H2O out, and the whole thing creates some energy as a byproduct. But the thing, that uses chemistry, but it only uses chemistry as a building block. It doesn't really care about well, why does CO2 combine with H2O get released as a byproduct? Well, why does this particular molecule have a valence of 4 instead of a valence of 3 in this context and 7.5 in that context? Well, why can't neutrons split into anti-gamma particles? By the way, why don't anti-gamma particles even exist? No, that's a lower level problem. We just take building blocks and we just use those building blocks and we do something on top. So cryptography is one building block, and the other sort of big discipline that we really draw a huge amount from is economics. So I mentioned earlier that the big sort of realization, or the sort of big mimetic contribution that Satoshi made, is the fact that he's treated cryptographic protocols as being economic protocols, where the economics is not just an afterthought. It's the incentives are a fundamental building layer of the entire system. Most of our latest models actually, talk about measuring cryptoeconomic security, not just in terms of, N/3, but actually measuring security in dollars. So, the term basically comes from this sort of fusion of two things, that, cryptography provides your little building blocks, economics defines how you talk about them, and that's, the intent is to sort of combine these two into a sort of formal science.
So what is the cryptocurrency research group?
The inspiration for the cryptocurrency research group is really this hard problems in cryptocurrency document that I wrote, where I identified some hard problems that I saw in the cryptocurrency space. Things like scalability, consensus, and this identity and reputation issue, cryptography, and so forth. And I realized that the cryptocurrency could potentially be much more powerful if these issues were solved. And there are serious issues. Like, the fact is that proof of work is nice and elegant, but it costs $600 million a year, and it costs another 5 cents for every transaction. And people, sure, if you're used to dealing with PayPal, then PayPal by itself, right now, because they're bloody monopolists, they can afford to charge much more than that. But the fact is, eventually companies are going to advance, regulators are going to get off their butts and start working with them to make it happen. And at some point, there's going to come a time when the traditional financial system is going to be able to do all of the stuff that existing cryptocurrency can do for a cheaper cost. And at that point, the decentralized part is just going to fall away. I think in order for decentralized technology to stay competitive, I think, it has to scale and the costs have to go way down. It has to actually be something that people are going to be willing to use, and that's just basically, that's fundamentally defensible, right? So the fundamental problems with consensus right now is that, first of all, there's a sort of expensive factor. And the thing is that some people think that it's sort of expensive in the way that, it's expensive now, but technology is going to get better, miners will get better, it'll get cheaper. But the thing is, no, it's a competitive activity, right? It's kind of like military technology. If you give everyone guns that are 10 times more powerful, you're not making the world 10 times better. You're just giving everyone 10 times better guns, and they all cancel each other out because you now have to have your 10x better guns to cancel out other people's 10x better guns. Like the only point of ASIC miners is to cancel out the bad guys' ASIC miners. And so if ASIC miners keep on getting better, and at the same time the system gets more centralized, then the networks may be qualitatively less secure. So, there are these sort of serious issues in the space that's just one example. The other example being this point that every node in the world processes every transaction, which is, it's a very inefficient design. And I started seeing these issues, I started seeing other issues, and I was trying to promote a research effort to try and, dedicate ourselves to try and solve these problems. So, and we just specified all these problems, this idea of how do you sort of securely feed data from the outside world into a blockchain? How do you do this sort of one ID per person thing, reputation systems, and so forth? And an issue is just a document. Here's the doc form, it's formalized, and people can think about it. And the CCRG was meant to fund, or to first of all, raise awareness of these, of the fact that these problems exist, and they're fun and you can work on them, and also ideally to potentially, help people get together and organize, and even to fund some of these projects. And we've already sort of gotten this community of people together that are interested in, sort of thinking about taking a fresh look at all of these problems. and trying to see, how can we take cryptocurrency technology to the point where it's really good enough to take on the mainstream, and be energized, be encouraged to think about all this stuff, to realize, hey, it turns out that it's really not that hard to build a dApp. And hey, I can understand stuff that's at the forefront, that's at the very forefront of cryptocurrency research, and maybe I can even personally make a contribution. I think that's actually the really, really nice thing about the space right now. It's just so young that, people like me can actually get to the point where we're actually making significant contributions. If you look at spaces like, standard computer science, programming language theory, math, you need to go through 10 years of old stuff before you even have enough information in order to be at the forefront where you can actually make contributions. And here it's just such a new industry, and there's so much potential that I'd like to see, hopefully see a lot more people just thinking about all this.
What do you think it's going to take to get it to that point where you walk down the street and 4 of them will have either understand or use on a daily basis or a consistent basis at least?
So it's sort of the same level of familiarity with cryptocurrency that we now have with the internet?
Yeah.
I think that the Bitcoin bubble is up until this point. I mean, the reason why they've all managed to happen and why each one's managed to be so much bigger than the previous have basically been because it's still, Bitcoin is still growing and it's still reaching larger and larger groups of people. The thing that was fundamentally different starting from 2014 is that, we've already conquered all the breadth, right? Over 50% of the population in the US has heard of Bitcoin. And so in order to make any kind of further gains whatsoever, I think that, we can't do breadth anymore. Maybe breadth will buy us another, half an order of magnitude, maybe get us a bubble up to $2,000 or $3,000. But, if we want cryptocurrency in general to succeed, we have to go from breadth to going to depth. And what does depth mean? Basically, it means that instead of increasing the number of people that have heard of it, increasing the level of involvement of each individual person. And the thing is that in order to get the depth, you have to actually, you can get to one level of depth by being interesting. You can get to another level of depth by being really exciting. In order to have really serious depth, you need practical applications. You need people to be actually using it because, not just because they ideologically really care about, decentralization, but because, hey, here's the technology, it solves the problem that I have. So eventually a practical application is going to come. And, and that's probably one of the things that I'm really starting to think about at this point, because, there is a sort of danger that I'm kind of feeling that all of this is just going to turn out to be for nothing. Because, sure, people point out all these nice use cases where, okay, the banking systems over here are stupid. It costs $200 over to send money across, and you have a bunch of bureaucracy around creating bank accounts, and people don't have them and so forth. But in order for those are sort of transient advantages that Bitcoin has, because it is a technology that's invented in 2009, and it does have all these advantages over stuff invented in the 1960s and 70s. But in order for its advantage to be sort of stable and worthwhile for the long term, you need to figure out sort of what are the fundamental benefits that it has. And, at this point, the financial system in the US is stupid is not a fundamental advantage, right? It's, you have to figure out, is the stupidity of the US financial system is something fundamental because of the way that it's organized, because of the fact that it's, governed in this particular way as opposed to Bitcoin, which is governed in this better way? Or is it just some transient thing that's just going to eventually fix itself? If this, is Bitcoin just going to get completely displaced by Venmo, basically? And you have to look at the fundamental advantages, and I think if you want to try and look for practical applications, you have to sort of start from those fundamental advantages and try to see, okay, what kinds of things really benefit from those fundamental advantages, and how do we develop products based on them? So I guess the one big practical example of that is basically Silk Road, because it shows that cryptocurrency does have the fundamental advantage that it's to put it euphemistically, in this case, it's a euphemism that I agree with. It's censorship resistant, and so it works. Equivalent competitors that use credit cards are just never going to get that big, and they're going to get shut down much more easily. So, that's one use case. It's sort of the first one. The question is, how do we go further? How do we get stuff that's sort of, I guess, more mainstream? And in order to do that, I guess you have to appeal to things other than uncensorability. And, what other advantages does decentralized technology have? I mean, I will provide some examples. So one example is, I found that, in general, if you look, in the real world, there is a sort of fundamental trade-off, I guess, between free entry on the one hand and trust on the other hand. So actually, just one example. Let's take, something like the Clipper cards that we use here in San Francisco for BART, Muni, and Caltrain, and so forth. I mean, that's a payment system, right? And it works well. It's very cheap. The card only costs $3, and it just keeps on working forever. And the reason why it manages to have such low costs is because it's a heavily trusted network. There basically are only 3 merchants that are allowed to be on the platform: BART, Muni, and Caltrain. And I guess buses you can count, so that's 4. So meanwhile, going further from there, you have this credit card system, and the credit card system, it's got more free entry. People can be merchants, but at the same time, you have these sort of increasing costs. You have these sort of trust issues, and finally, eventually, all the way at the other end, you have something like cash. So, the more free entry you add, on some level, it consistently it keeps on adding friction, and there are a lot of industries where if you go really, really free entry, there are these sort of trust problems that arise. And because of these trust problems, the industry sort of just doesn't even necessarily exist. As one really practical example of that, look at something like file storage. File storage, right now we do, people use things like AWS, things like Dropbox, and various other parts of centralized cloud storage. It's kind of painful for me to call it cloud storage. Like clouds are something that just feels inherently decentralized. I almost feel this sort of deceptive metaphor because it sort of implies that it's something that you could just sort of forget about when really, no, it's controlled by somebody and they're giving half your data to the NSA. Maybe only a quarter. Can you create a cloud storage market that anyone can participate in? And so the problems that we had so far are basically, number 1, how do you ensure quality of service? Number 2, what's the incentive to even continue storing files? Number 3, are these laptops the files are storing on just going to disappear? Can I even trust people to hold my data? And these are all real problems, right? Now, the thing is that in the real world, we don't think about these sort of trust problems too much, and the reason is that we've solved these trust problems by giving up free entry, and instead we have monopoly problems. And instead of people talking about, in the Bitcoin world, the problems are people talk about our trust problems. It's like, oh hey, Mt. Gox just ran away with 650,000 Bitcoins. In the real world, we've kind of managed to getting away from trust problems by substituting them with monopoly problems, and instead, guess what people complain about? People charging, $1 a megabyte roaming fees, net neutrality, whatever kind of discriminatory content policies, PayPal basically acting as a sort of private law enforcement arm and shutting down WikiLeaks, all these things that would not exist in a competitive market. Well, the problem is if you have a competitive market, then you get back to the trust problems. So with cryptography and cryptoeconomics, what I'm seeing is basically a way of ensuring very, very high free entry, but at the same time still maintaining a higher degree of trust. So one example for decentralized file storage, there's this protocol called erasure coding that allows you to take a gigabyte file, then split it into 20 chunks of 100 megabytes each, such that any 10 of those chunks can be used to reconstruct the original file. So 20 chunks of 100 megabytes, that's 2 gigabytes, split them across 20 computers, any 10 of those can be sort of mathematically combined to get you the original gigabyte back. So it's sort of 2x split, but statistically speaking, unless more than half the network disappears, your chances of losing the file are basically incredibly tiny. So this is one example of decentralization in practice solving the problem of, well, what if this guy has bad quality of service and disappears? Second thing is incentivization. So at the sort of low free entry, high barrier to entry side of the spectrum, you don't really need incentivization because you say, okay, well, you have the legal system, and if somebody does something really, really bad, then you can sue them, or you can regulate them or whatever. Here, you don't have that because this little guy in his laptop is just not worth suing or regulating, and it's just too expensive too. So instead, you need to have economic incentives. You need to have this idea of, hey, let's have this guy put down a security deposit, and if he misbehaves, then we have a protocol which automatically destroys the security deposit and donates it to UNICEF. So that's basically an alternative way of policing, an alternative way of ensuring that these kind of trust issues don't appear. And it solves the problem without introducing these monopoly problems because you still have a market that anyone can participate in. So the point, I guess, is it's about separating the software developer from the service provider and saying, instead of there being only one provider of a service, which also is the developer, saying, okay, you can develop an application, and then once it's out there, anyone can be on the provider market, anyone can be on the receiver market. You have high degree of competition, and you have crypto economic security to ensure that the whole thing is trustworthy. So, that's the sort of general basis of my argument for why cryptocurrency can possibly work and be useful, beyond the whole censorship resistant stuff, which I do think is valuable for political reasons, but that's not going to convince Barack Obama to start accepting cryptocurrency.
Cool. Okay, so let's do one thing to wrap it up. Give me your best case, worst case scenario. If I could write the script, this is what would happen in the universe of cryptocurrency, of crypto economics. Worst case, what do we get out of it?
There are a lot of people that see it as a binary thing. I've actually kind of been starting to see it as less and less so. So, with Bitcoin itself, sure, it's got some chance of going much higher. It's got some chance of replacing gold as the world's reserve currency. Theoretically, it is, as much as I complain about proof of work, it is better than gold mining, which is a wasteful zero-sum activity and really hurts the environment. And Bitcoin has a more predictable supply than gold does, if you care about that. And so there is this possibility that gold will overtake gold. It'll have a $7 trillion market cap. Each Bitcoin will be worth $3 million. And I think a lot of people sort of are of the mindset that the current value of gold basically, or of Bitcoin, is basically predicated on the tiny possibility that it will achieve much larger outcomes. For cryptocurrency in general, I actually think there's a range of possibilities. There is this possibility that it's just not going to end up being useful for much more than Silk Road. And if it's not that large, then, if the government really cares, they'll just 51% attack it to death. There's the possibility that it will sort of become a boring back-end industrial tool used in some use cases, just sort of interbank clearing, international trade, and a bunch of sort of other fields that are maybe highly bureaucratized now and would prefer to organize themselves in a way that's also highly bureaucratized, but highly bureaucratized using better technology. From there, you get to consumer use cases, you get to, it taking over certain specific parts of the internet where it works well. IPFS taking over and becoming a sort of the primary way of storing content instead of something like Imager. A decentralized chat client succeeding and so forth. Then, this idea of free entry markets succeeding as the way of organizing resources in certain specific industries, and then you go up from there to the point where eventually or in the most extreme positive case, you have everything basically running on crypto, and the government becomes replaced with a DAO and so forth. And I really do think that everything along that line is possible. It's just a matter of right now we're still in this weird stage where there's a lot of excitement, there aren't too many use cases, and it's all a matter of to what degree will the excitement translate into use cases. To what degree will the people that care about the sort of values that cryptocurrency embodies actually manage to carry their commitments through to fruition, and to what extent will people just give up on it and say, hey, whatever, we'll just go back to trusting people, and I guess the monopolists really aren't all that bad, and and if they get too bad, then we'll use our monopolistic governments to regulate them. And hard to see, it's hard to say, precisely because of that. I think binary isn't quite the right word. I think the right word is, as Nassim Taleb would say, a fat-tailed distribution, in the sense that it's something where there is this large chance, as far as just as a metric, the total market cap of cryptocurrency in 5 years, there's a very large chance it'll be between $0 and $1 billion. There is a chance it'll be between $1 billion and $10 billion. There's a chance it'll be between $10 billion and $100 billion, and so forth. It just keeps on going up. I think it's probably roughly a sort of a bell curve on an exponential axis, so to speak. So, if you take the number of digits in the total market cap, that's the thing that's going to have a bell curve on it. So, stuff could happen, but the thing is that because the whole thing is sort of dependent on network effects, because all these technologies work so nicely synergistically together, you do have this situation where the more it succeeds, the easier it is to succeed more, and so, It is really hard to say exactly where on the curve it's going to fall, but it's in a lot of ways it is kind of like a startup in a very extreme sense. Like startups do kind of work the same way, right? And for venture capitalists, when they invest in a startup, they know that there's a 90% chance this thing's going to fail. There's a 5% chance or whatever it's going to earn me back my original investment. There's a 2% chance it'll earn me somewhere from 2 to 10x. There's a 1% chance it'll earn me 10 to 100x. And there's a 1% chance it'll become the next Google. And if you look at, say, the set of companies that a VC firm invested in one particular year, and then you look at all of them 5 years later, you often have the situation that a single one of them is worth more than all the rest of them combined. So, this sort of pattern, it exists just about everywhere, and, cryptocurrency is just one of those things that it's really subject to, probably just because it's this sort of thing that's trying to do multiple paradigm shifts at the same time, and it's entirely, unclear to what extent any of them will succeed. You got this really weird thing, I guess. You might want to compare it to something like the Drake equation, where people are trying to analyze what is the probability that aliens exist and are going to come and either save us or kill us, and they try and say, well, here's the probability that a star is going to have planets around it, times the probability that a planet's going to be in the right zone to have intelligent life, times the probability that some life is going to evolve, times the probability that that's going to turn into intelligent life, times the probability that that's not going to suicide itself, times the probability that they care about us. And there's all these different factors, and sometimes the estimates for them are off by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude. And here it's kind of similar in that you have these different ideas that cryptocurrency fundamentally depends on. These ideas that for this concept of free entry markets is a genuinely valid path that has the ability to substantially increase efficiency in society. You have this, you have this idea that the kind of personal freedom that cryptocurrency technologies embody is good and is heavily desired by people. You have some of the economic ideas. You have some of these other sort of side projects that cryptocurrencies like sneaking in, like the idea that, hey, we should really be using public key cryptography to secure payments instead of this absurd credit card mechanism where you sort of do your private use. Basically give merchants your private key. That's literally what credit card payments are like. And you have all of these things, and it's not really, and there's going to be a lot of interplay between them. It's not really clear how well any of them is going to do. I mean, in some cases it's multiplicative. In some cases it's also weird because it's kind of additive in that, if at least one of these different directions succeeds, cryptocurrency is going to get somewhere. If 2 of them succeed, it's going to be 10 times bigger. If 3 of them succeed, it's going to be 100 times bigger. If all of them succeed, then the government's going to be a DAO, and theoretically we'll all be either all be in a utopia, or maybe the DAO is just going to turn against us and kill all of us with drones. And then for some reason the governance algorithm just forgot to care about everything after block 232, and so it doesn't really matter. The DAO just forgot to care about the fact that only humans to maintain it. So at this point, all I know is that what I'm focusing on is just trying to improve the technology, trying to get cost of consensus down, and trying to say, if this stuff is going to be valuable at all, then these are the things that it needs to be viable. Let's try and get to them. That's one component. The other component is, it's important not to try to say, well, we have Bitcoin. Bitcoin is perfect now, and let me come up with some crazy hand-twisting arguments for why things have to be exactly the way they are here. It's a matter of, it's the first implementation of a technology. It's a revolutionary paradigm shift. It also got some things wrong. let's step back, let's take a fresh look, and let's see what we can improve. And yeah, hopefully something's going to come out of this.
Follow us on Twitter to be the first to know about new videos on theprotocol.tv.